Welcome everyone to the 9th episode of the In Conversation Roundtable discussion on challenging economic assumptions. As we recognise that international context can make scheduling very difficult, and I would like to express my gratitude for our speakers who are up very early or staying up very late to join us today. My name is Carmel Williams and I'm the Director of the Centre for Health and Policy's Research Translation. And joining with my colleagues Claire Murphy and Professor Jerry McCartney, we've worked together on developing and running the Challenging Economic Assumptions podcast series. I'd now like to make an acknowledgement of country before we formally get into the rest of the webinar. In the spirit of reconciliation, the Centre for Health and Policy's Research Translation and University of Glasgow acknowledges the traditional custodians of country all throughout the world and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past, present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and Indigenous peoples around the world today. So I'll tell you a little bit more about the Centre for Health and Policies and the In Conversation Roundtable series. So we decided to embark on this In Conversation Boundary Spanners, Thinkers and Policy Actors Roundtable series with the aim of raising the profile of topical and challenging societal problems and to really explore their potential solutions, with the aim of understanding and helping to progress work across research, policy and practice communities and assist moving each of these issues forward through increased collaboration and thoughtful action. This, the 9th episode of the Conversation Roundtable, focuses on the Challenging Economic Assumptions podcast series, jointly hosted by the University of Glasgow and the Centre for Health and Policy's Research Translation. The podcast series was established in 2024 and explores the assumptions that sit behind global economic systems and beliefs. We're delighted that today's roundtable's discussion will feature some of our esteemed guest speakers from the podcast series, and I'll be delighted to introduce them to you shortly. Each speaker will speak on their topic for a few minutes, and then following their 3 brief presentations, we've allocated time for discussion and dialogue between the speakers. So please place your questions in the chat because they'll be really interested to hear your thoughts and hear your questions and try to answer some of them for you. So let me introduce our esteemed speakers. Firstly, we're joined by Martin Hensher. He is a Henry Baldwin Professor, Professorial Research Fellow in Health Systems Sustainability, with many years' experience of senior executive management of large multidisciplinary teams of public servants and specialists to deliver complex projects and programs. Martin has extensive global experience in health economics, planning and financing, and his current work explores how healthcare systems can meet the environmental, economic and societal challenges of the years ahead. And there's quite a big task ahead of us there. Our next speaker we're joined by Mohsen Javdani. He's an Associate Professor of Economics and has an extensive career spanning applied and empirical economics, labour economics and economic inequality. Much of his work has a core central theme of understanding and challenging the mechanisms and processes that hinder plurality and produce inequality, injustice, exclusion and marginalisation. I'll be looking forward to your discussion, Mohsen. Our final speaker is Sarah McKinley. She's a global expert in community wealth building, a trained urban planner with a background in community development. Sarah works in partnership with local governments, community practitioners and movement organisers to develop community wealth building strategies that deliver lasting economic transformation. For over 12 years, Sarah has worked with Democracy Collaborative and the leading Think and Do Advancing Democratisation of the Economy, and was instrumental in helping to develop the community wealth building frame. But I understand that Sarah has also now moved and is in a freelance role. And lastly, but importantly, I'd like to introduce the co-host of the Challenging Economic Assumptions podcast series, Professor Jerry McCartney. Jerry is Professor of Wellbeing Economy at the University of Glasgow and is an honorary consultant in public health at Public Health Scotland. Highly experienced in economics and public health, Jerry has a keen interest in the interplay between economics, the political environment, and population and public health. And it's been a pleasure to work with Jerry these past few months. So just to set the scene for today's roundtable discussion, it might be helpful to provide a little bit of context. So economic theory underpins the actions of governments and business community alike. The values, assumptions, and models that sit behind economics drive the allocation of budgets, regulatory and tax regimes, and the design of social support systems. The influence of economics as an academic discipline and economists as a profession is pervasive across policymaking. Tackling the assumptions that sit behind economics is difficult. There are powerful forces operating within the political sphere and within communities. Those who benefit from the current system resist change. However, the global community is facing increasing complexity, and this is generating new ideas and new discussions where some scholars and community organisations are questioning the pursuit of economic outcomes above all else, thereby challenging the status quo. The question of whether economic models are fit for purpose is live, and particularly so in the context of climate change, growing global insecurity, and the potential emergence of new pandemic threats. So today we're hoping to provide an opportunity to examine and reevaluate some of the principles and models that sit behind dominant economic theories and explore what the evidence base is that informs these models. Are they appropriate for the current global challenges? Can they be adapted to be a better fit? And if so, then how? And these are some of the discussions that we're really hoping to hear from our wonderful speakers today. So I'm just going to remind you again that we'll have these 3 brief presentations, and then there's been time allocated for dialogue and discussion between the speakers. And we'd really love to have some questions from the audience to have them respond to. But now I'd like to move on to invite Martin, who's our first speaker for today, to provide his brief overview and presentation. Over to you, Martin.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes really just talking about the work I do and kind of how I have been moving from being a fairly regular health economist to doing something different, still very much in the space of economics. So I studied economics as an undergraduate in a very standard way. I found some of it quite strange, but I also found economics extremely interesting, and the topics it was covering always rather fascinated me. And then I should level with you as an audience. I've spent my entire career in health and healthcare, largely as a result of an accident of circumstance, which was that the National Health Service in the UK were the first people unwise enough to give me a proper job after leaving university, and that kind of led me into health, where I then discovered that there was a discipline called health economics. Health economics is a branch of welfare economics within the neoclassical school, but I loved health economics because actually at that time it asked lots of challenging questions about why health and healthcare in particular departed massively from the kind of standard assumptions we had about markets and competition and things. Over my career, though, which is rather longer than I care to tell you, now working in health economics, I've kind of seen that challenging and questioning side of health economics has been pushed down or kind of worn away by much more straightforward, kind of more neoclassically and in policy terms often neoliberal inclined directions. And kind of maybe about 10 years ago, I suppose, that led me to really start thinking. At that time, I was still a public servant working for the state government in Tasmania, but that got me thinking about things and started me on a more academic path, doing a PhD, where I started to think about heterodox schools of economics, how they might be applied to health and healthcare, and what sort of different story might they tell us about that. And I've ended up kind of thinking about things like modern monetary theory, but particularly feminist economics, which is trying to look at the economy actually as the whole social provisioning system, but particularly ending up actually really, if anything, I guess I'd call myself an ecological health economist, because I found that the framing of ecological economics is particularly applicable. And that's because ecological economics looks at the scale of the economy, how big can the economy be to be sustainable. It also looks at fair distribution of resources, and it still looks at efficient allocation of resources, which is obviously the kind of the original focus of standard economics. So let's go to the next slide. So that really leads me to work in two areas. So the next slide here, this one, talking about really how overconsumption and misconsumption. So overconsumption, as the name suggests, is consuming too much, more than is good for us. Misconsumption is consuming things that are just simply bad for us, that we shouldn't be consuming in the first place. How those things come together in the wider economy on the left-hand side and drive all kinds of illness and adverse health effects, which are essentially preventable. We could have stopped people from suffering most or possibly even all of those harms if they weren't being driven by a very overconsumption driven, growth driven, wider economic model. So that makes people sick, which then of course pushes them into the healthcare system, where the healthcare system is trying to fix up the illnesses that overconsumption has caused. But we can then get stuck in a kind of a cycle of what can be called failure demand, where not only are we trying to fix up people who are sick preventably, but then actually within the healthcare system, for a not insignificant proportion of people, we're doing things to them that they don't really need. We're giving them non-beneficial and unnecessary care. And sometimes we're also harming them when we do low quality care. So some people get stuck in a horrible kind of loop of they're sick preventably, and then in the health system, we end up actually potentially doing more harm than good to some people. So I'm super interested in that and how overconsumption, health come together, and how that then drives problems in healthcare. And if we go to the next slide, I'm also very interested in the kind of fairly ubiquitous phenomenon of diminishing marginal returns. And if I had to put my hat on a real economic law, I reckon the only real economic law is the law of diminishing returns. So that as you push more resources into something, the benefit you get from it gets less and less. So these graphs just show some research we were doing on global healthcare expenditure, showing how as countries spend more and more and more on healthcare, they get less and less and less incremental improvement in the health of their population, even while some of the poorest countries with very low healthcare expenditure could get massive improvements in the health of their population through really very small, relatively increases in healthcare spending. So again, I'm very interested in that, because both of these phenomena, overconsumption and diminishing marginal returns, conventional economics really struggles to deal either with questions, with the central question really of too much, and attached to questions of too much, of course, comes questions of not enough, from an equity perspective about those who don't have the right access to resources. So that's kind of been driving my research, as I kind of more, I think, overtly say I'm trying to develop an agenda here for an ecological health economics as a discipline. So that's me, and I'm going to hand over to Mohsen.
So as part of challenging economic assumptions, I think we need to confront some of the powerful ideas that shape public and policy discourse. Ideas such as markets being efficient, self-regulating, and naturally producing optimal outcomes, while the state is inherently inefficient and wasteful, that globalization and technological change follow an inevitable and welfare-enhancing path, shaped by market competition rather than political power, that austerity is necessary to contain government debt because the state might run out of money, or that individuals are rational, self-interested utility maximizers, or that nature is external to the economy, that ecological crises are market failures instead of symptoms of an economic model that treats the planet as an infinite input to cater to our unlimited wants. I think to challenge these assumptions effectively and meaningfully, we must also challenge the intellectual foundations, the ideological architecture of mainstream economics that Martin was talking about, which remains strikingly monolithic and narrow. In other words, we need to challenge not only what we believe about the economy, but how the discipline of economics itself produces and legitimizes many of those beliefs while presenting itself as objective, value neutral, and scientific. So in the next couple of minutes, I want to reflect briefly on why economics holds such unique power and why democratizing that power by learning the language of power, which is economics, is essential if you truly want to challenge economic assumptions. Next slide, please. It is well understood that economics occupies a unique position of power among the social sciences. This influence rests on three kinds of power. First is the professional authority. Economics enjoys a special status as the scientific voice of policy and policy making. Second is the institutional position of economists who sit inside some of the most important institutions that govern our lives: central banks, finance ministries, and national and international elite networks. Third, and in my view, perhaps the most important and the least visible, is economists' role in shaping what we might call the cognitive infrastructure of public policy making. This is the economic styles of reasoning and technical tools that shape how we understand and imagine the world. These frameworks reframe complex social realities in economic terms, privileging what can be counted and priced over what matters in lived experience. Economic styles of reasoning are ways of thinking that define the mental frameworks, concepts, and language through which governments and citizens alike make sense of the economy. The technical policy tools, such as models, indicators, and forecasting techniques, not only inform decisions, but actively shape the realities that they measure. They influence how people and institutions behave as they respond to the metrics and incentives that are built into these policy tools. And of course, we see their influence everywhere in our everyday lives. Housing unaffordability is reduced to a simplistic model of supply and demand. Immigrant integration is measured by earnings, taxes paid, and benefits received. Student learning is defined by test-based outcomes, and societal prosperity and well-being is captured almost entirely by things like GDP growth. Similarly, when monetary cost-benefit analysis becomes the dominant method for evaluating different programs, the method itself embeds assumptions about what is valuable and what is not, and whose lives and futures count more, effectively shaping what becomes politically possible. And I want to underscore the fact that these are not neutral descriptions. They are cognitive frames that define what counts as a problem, what counts as evidence for those problems, and what solutions appear reasonable and legitimate. While economists often claim to have limited influence over specific policy choices, they exert disproportionate power in defining the boundaries of what is seen as responsible or realistic policy. So in that sense, economics isn't just about analyzing society, it's really a way of organizing society. Next slide, please. Joanne Robinson, the prominent Cambridge economist, once wrote, "The purpose of studying economics is not to acquire a set of ready-made answers to economic questions, but to learn how to avoid being deceived by economists." I really like that line because it reminds us that economics is never neutral. Behind every model and policy rule lie value judgments, assumptions, and interests. Robinson was arguing that it is urgent for us to cultivate critical literacy to see where authority and ideology meet and to keep asking whose knowledge counts and to what extent. Next slide, please. Georges Clemenceau, the French statesman, said during World War I, war is too important to be left to the generals. And I think by the same token, economics is too important to be left to economists. If Joanne Robinson calls us to think critically, this idea pushes us to act collectively. Economic ideas shape everything: our jobs, our housing, public services, physical and mental health, and our climate futures and the future of our children. Long-standing critiques of mainstream economics shows that the field is built on a strong but often hidden ideological architecture. It is intellectually narrow, and it continues to marginalize alternative perspectives. So in my view, to challenge economic assumptions, we must also challenge economics itself, opening the discipline to pluralism, to participation, and to the messy realities of social life. Every model, including economic models, is a story, it's a narrative. And the stories we tell about how the world works always shape the possibilities for changing it. So that's for me. I'm going to hand it over to Sarah McKinley.
Thank you, Mohsen, and thank you, Carmel, and everyone for having me and having us here. It's a great discussion and actually a beautiful sequencing. So thank you for that setup, because I'm going to talk a little bit more about how practical ways in which we can start to challenge economic assumptions and what that looks like. And I think picking off of Mohsen's point there about telling a story and expanding imagination around economics is deeply important to doing that. And community wealth building, which I'm going to speak about, is one way to do that. It is a way to model a more plural way of doing economics in place. So it's a model, it's a practice, it's a real-time on the ground experimentation with economic tools in your community. So I'm just going to speak a little bit about that and look forward to exploring how all these things are, in fact, really deeply connected. So community wealth building is an economic development model, a local economic development model focused on transforming local economies based on direct community ownership and control of wealth generating assets in place. So the goal of a community wealth building strategy is to address inequality at its core by looking at inequality of ownership of economic assets, so that we can broaden and create shared economic prosperity that creates well-being by design, not as an afterthought, but as a central design tenet to local economic institutions. It does so by ensuring that wealth that is produced in all of our communities is broadly held and locally rooted so that it benefits people, place, and planet. So it does so by looking across 5 different areas of a local economy, which we call the 5 pillars of community wealth building. And those include progressive procurement, so local spending flows that exist in every community. What are the institutions and economic actors in our communities investing in terms of purchasing goods and services, hiring, the land and properties that they own? How are those things being used? Thinking about that broadly and experimenting with different ways of collectively owning and managing and determining the direction of these investment flows that already exist in our community. Similarly, land and property, huge wealth generating, in fact, often the largest wealth generating assets in all of our communities. Ensuring that land and property is working for our public good rather than for a limited enclosed interest, which of course that is a big phenomenon that is happening across all of our communities right now, the further enclosure of land and property and the speculation upon that, which is creating things like the housing crisis that we've already touched on. Fair work. Our labor is a huge asset. How do we ensure that we are using labor to create beneficial returns rather than a transactional arrangement, which is what it often is in most of our communities? So how can we support living wages, advance union rights, but increasingly, how can we ensure that workers have real control and democratic engagement over their workplace and their work conditions, so that they can have a greater self-determination in the workplace? Importantly, inclusive and democratic enterprises. So our enterprise ownership, thinking of that really broadly and in new terms, and not just new, actually. And that I use the term new, but it is a bit of a misnomer, because a lot of these models that need to be brought into our community are models that have been at play in indigenous communities, in communities that have been cut out from traditional mainstream economic activity for generations. These are things like cooperatives, mutuals, things of that nature that really are about how we collectively meet our needs and share our resources in a meaningful way. So looking at how we can integrate those kinds of enterprise ownership in creative new ways, and ultimately finance, right? The capital that is generated, how are we ensuring that capital is reinvested in our communities through a publicly owned, community owned, mutually owned institutions, new kinds of recirculatory funds, and really beginning to challenge in an active way the assumptions that go into finance, things like, profit margins and fiscal rules and things like that, but actively creating and designing new tools in our communities that we can use right away. And there's a lot of activity in that space, which is really exciting. Next slide, please. And the real power of a community wealth building strategy is ensuring that all of the activity in all of those 5 pillars are connected to one another, so that you're not having a cooperative enterprise over here that's entirely disconnected from the procurement flows of local institutions, for example. How are we connecting those things, ensuring that they're using property and land in sustainable and regenerative ways, and creating a space where work is more fair and more just and more democratic. And then, of course, connecting all of that with infrastructure, capacity building, connectivity, resource generation, things of that nature, so that these things are not acting in isolation, but are greater than the sum of their parts and really can come together. A key piece of this puzzle, and I already touched on this when I spoke about procurement, is working with what we call anchor institutions. So local, place-based institutions, usually nonprofit or public serving institutions that have a mission to serve. These are things like hospitals. We heard Martin speak about how so often hospitals are addressing things downstream that we could be addressing upstream. How can we ensure that the economic outputs of hospitals and institutions are actually going to really creating good health before it becomes a problem that we're then having to deal with in that failure demand cycle that Martin spoke to? So hospitals, universities, local governments, cultural institutions, these are the largest employers, the biggest purchasers of goods and services, and the largest landholders in most communities. How are we ensuring that those institutions that essentially are meant to be serving all of us are connected to creating a more generative economy of place that enables us to really start to practice a plural and dynamic and resilient way of being together in community? So connecting the economic market shaping power of those institutions to growing the community and community rooted and collectively owned institutions that we would like to see in a new economy. And how does all of this come together in a way that isn't just a one-off nice project that ameliorates the ill effects of our extractive system, but begins to model an alternative to our extractive system. So the idea is to begin to incrementally disrupt some of that local activity and begin to displace the market share of extractive economic activity in our communities. So it's a gradual, but ultimately it is a model of what we call evolutionary reconstruction. Next slide, please. And the good news is that there is this kind of activity in every single community, activity in all of those 5 pillars. Community land trusts, I already spoke of cooperatives, mutuals, recirculatory green funds, things of this nature. There are tons and tons of these activities happening in every community. And increasingly, you're starting to see those different activities connecting the dots in very intentional ways to really begin to augment the impact of these activities in place. So you're seeing places like Cleveland, Ohio, create a network of employee-owned green cooperatives to meet the purchasing needs of local hospitals and universities in Cleveland, employing local, formerly unemployed, formerly incarcerated individuals have been cut out of the economic system and cut out of job creation and other things of that nature, and are now creating a network of these cooperatives that are benefiting and meeting the needs of their community, creating and recirculating wealth for those workers and for their families and communities around them. You're seeing it happen in Preston, where the city government, Preston in the north of England, a former post-industrial city, where the city council very intentionally redirected most of its purchasing, or as much of their purchasing as they could locally, creating student housing, creating community-owned bus depots, creating public development, publicly owned cinema, things of that nature. And now you're starting to see in places like Scotland that being picked up on a broader regional and national level. So in fact, in Scotland, just I believe it was in March of this year, they introduced to the Scottish Parliament a Community Wealth Building Act that requires all local authorities across Scotland to integrate community wealth building strategies into their economic plans. So how can they work with local communities to broaden these community-owned opportunities? And a huge focus in Scotland, and certainly in many other countries, is renewables as a sector to help begin to do that. How can we ensure that the growth of renewables, that it's not only displacing fossil fuel, but is creating space for more generative ownership of resources in place, community ownership of renewals on community-owned land that returns not just profit, but value to the community, and the community can control and direct the outcomes of that. So there's lots of stuff happening all over the place. Our role now is really, how do we knit all these things together in really conscientious and intentional ways so that they begin to actively displace, not just locally, but across the globe, the kinds of activities, the economic activities that are driving us to the brink. So I'm happy to get into discussion. I know I went a little over time, but I think overall we're doing well. And I'll pass it back to you, Carmel.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And actually great introductions and scene setting and discussions had by all of the 3 speakers. I have many questions that I'd like to ask, but I think perhaps we can start, and I'd like to invite Jerry to also kind of contribute to this discussion as he sees fit. So you've discussed the current economic situation, and I think really highlighted that there are many significant challenges with the way the current system and understanding of economics is operating. And you've touched on that there are these underlying biases that really enable and maintain the status quo, which I guess speaks to the power dynamics that are operating. So I guess I would love to hear from you. And Sarah, you've given us a great example of what can be done to try to kind of challenge this. But what can we do at kind of a system level, a structural system level, to really work towards the sort of economies that we want to have to help address the needs of and the challenges facing our planet and our communities. So to say it a bit more clearly, what are the system changes that you think need to be put in place to be able to really start to address these issues? And what do you see as the first step? So I'd just like to invite all of you to kind of respond to that.
I'll start. It's a huge question, right? There's so much that can change. And I mean, one of the, I should say, beauty, but also challenges of doing this work is, you know, we need all the hands at the wheel, right? We need many, many, many things happening at the same time. So you can come at this at many different directions, which is exciting, and then presents a challenge of coordination, which we certainly need to get better at. I think the beauty of working in community wealth building is we're experimenting with these things in real time, right? We're trying to do these things in real time. And that's really, really hard work, but it also gives you a very clear view of the things that need to change, right? So, I mean, and these things can be very, very specific, like procurement law, right? In the EU, for example, competition law means that you cannot specify or value local contractors, right? You cannot favor local contractors over a multinational, for example. You might be able to create other criteria that look at social value or things like that might favor someone on the local, but things like challenging and changing competition law at the EU level as one example of things that we can change, and there are things that are moving to change that. So very, very specific things like that. But ultimately, what I think is really important about doing this modeling work on the ground is that it inspires what's possible, right? So it helps to create that narrative that Mohsen was talking about, that we need to tell a story of an alternative. Because in fact, the biggest challenge, despite all these very specific things like fiscal rules and procurement policy and contract design and you name it, and legal incorporation laws for cooperatives, you know, all of that does need to change, but the reason why it's so hard to change that is because people are so very narrow in how they view what's possible. And so that cultural shift, and I've done this work for long enough that I think people, and we are at a sort of tipping point, a rhetorical tipping point at least, where people are really, really open to these ideas, but we don't know how to do it. We don't know how to break the professional inertias. We don't know how people have been trained in very narrow ways of thinking about how things should be done. And it's really, really hard to change that without sort of this very much broader enabling context of cultural shift and the art of the possible. So I don't know if that really gets to exactly your question.
I think you
starts to fire ideas.
Yeah, you certainly laid out a number of areas of work. But Mohsen, you were chipping in, so please share your thoughts. And I guess what we're looking for here is really to understand. I think you particularly touched on this, the structural and systemic barriers to that are built into the system. So, and obviously, I think Sarah's touched on that we need to be starting at a local level. But we also need to be working at these institutional level and a higher level. So I guess I'd really love to hear, are there, you know, do you have hope, and do you feel that there are places that we can turn our attention to? And please, Martin and Jerry, we'd love to hear from you as well.
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, my thoughts also connect closely to what Sarah was talking about in terms of the need for cultural shift. And the fact that one of the main barriers seems to be the very narrow frameworks that people usually adopt when it comes to imagining other alternatives. I think, you know, at a systemic level, from the perspective that I look at this issue, one of the first steps is to democratize economic knowledge and decision making. You know, right now, economic expertise is concentrated in a small professional community, in finance ministries, central banks, or think tanks, which define what is responsible or realistic policy. I think what we need to do is to open up that conversation so that workers, communities, and citizens can participate meaningfully in shaping the economic narratives that govern their lives. And that what that could look like in practice, for example, in terms of education, in terms of knowledge production, it means teaching economics as a pluralist, contested discipline, not a single truth, but a field of competing perspectives. It seems like Martin and I sort of share a similar trajectory, which is a very uncommon trajectory. Like Martin, I was also trained as a mainstream economist and then moved slowly away from mainstream economics. But there is not really much in terms of options for you to receive any training or education outside mainstream economics. So I think that type of pluralistic approach to teaching economics would also allow students to learn to ask questions like who benefits, as opposed to being obsessed with what's efficient. In terms of policy making, I think, and this connects closely to what Sarah was talking about, embedding deliberative and participatory processes. So some of the great examples were the ones that Sarah gave. Other examples are like citizen assemblies on budgets, climate policy, or work that bring lived experience into spaces that are often dominated by technocrats. And in public discourse, I think supporting media, unions, and community organizations that can transfer economic issues into accessible collective debates. So economics becomes a language people can use, not one that excludes them.
That's really helpful. So who you're going to say something, Jerry?
Yeah, just to kind of try and deepen this conversation a little bit, because I think what you were describing, Mohsen, was how power has become a really important facet of how economics is taught and understood and communicated and ultimately adopted. And there is a school of thought that suggests that this is not an accident, that there has been a lot of money funneled into the funding of economics departments, of economic think tanks, through institutions like the Mont Pelerin Society, the Heritage Foundation. How much weight do you give to those kinds of arguments?
I think that's certainly important, right? Because one idea that you usually hear when it comes to challenging the dominance that mainstream economics has on economic thought and education and policy making is that they pretend like other things, that this has happened in a free marketplace of ideas, and mainstream economics has become sort of prevalent because in that free marketplace of ideas they were the ones who provided better ideas and insights. And what you highlighted sort of underscores one of the important aspects of that type of simplistic narrative, where power dynamics and vested interest are closely linked to the kind of ideas that are isolated and marginalized, as opposed to ideas that are sort of promoted and are given legitimacy. So I think those types of dynamics are certainly part of what becomes a dominant discourse.
Martin, did you have anything that you'd like to add to this conversation?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. So I think both Sarah and Mohsen have talked a bit about for want of a better word, you might talk about sort of democratization or re-democratization of economics. And I just put my perspective. So having been a public servant in several different countries, the theory is actually fairly straightforward. The idea is that through our democratic systems, society sets the objectives through the politicians, and then the officials and the specialists, then their job is to work out how to achieve those objectives. So that's still the principle on which all of this stuff is kind of constitutionally meant to work in most democratic countries. Yet it's been flipped, as people have said. So we have the sort of the specialist kind of elite, particularly in economics, kind of constrain the space. So it's actually not such a big ask to flip that around, but what it needs is kind of new approaches to democratization and an increasing voice for people, for ordinary people, in setting us different objectives. So I think it might not be as far away as we might think within our systems. I mean, just a couple of other things that I'd like to throw in, though. I do think we have to start rethinking ideas about corporate personhood and limited liability. I personally I'm not somebody who thinks we should get rid of private companies and private markets and stuff. I think that's not ever going to happen. But I think we can start pulling back the rights of companies vis-a-vis humans, and particularly, really bluntly, making directors and shareholders more directly liable for the harms that companies cause. That will be the quickest way to start reducing the harms that they're doing. And then a final thing, which I think is a bit harder, which I'm thinking a lot about in healthcare, is so particularly, Sarah's kind of vision of relocalization, which I'm wholeheartedly behind. But healthcare is a super interesting example of huge benefits to that in some areas, but also there are limits. There are the very high-tech end of healthcare is very hard to relocalize, kind of complex technologies and drugs, which we do not want to lose their big benefits. How can we make that work? How can we have sort of the very modern end of the highly concentrated supply chain still working in a way which supports the relocalization of kind of much of the rest of what we're trying to achieve in healthcare?
So, I mean, I think all of you have touched on areas that need a bit of focus. I do have a question in the chat, actually, from Claire. So she is interested in trying to understand, I think we've been talking about ideology, and power, but I think Claire's question goes to the role of individuals and individual ideology that each of us, I guess, operate under. And that, what do you think about, where is there a role for some of us to challenge these ideologies in others, if we feel that they're really reinforcing this inequitable power dynamic and reinforcing the status quo of the system, which I think you've all talked on, that we need to change the system because it's not delivering, it's not fit for purpose for the climate and the planet alongside for many people. I guess that's a kind of controversial question in terms of, challenging individual ideology. But if we think about it, we could perhaps frame it as, going back to Sarah and Mohsen talking about the need to educate people. Is that a way? Anyway, what are people's thoughts about that? Anyone going to be brave enough to have a go?
Yeah, I'll be the sacrificial lamb again, especially because I've got a lot of buzz from what we were just talking about too. And Martin, I just want to say I agree with your last point about localization, and community wealth building should not be interpreted as a only local and localism purity, because I think that's problematic. And I think we need to keep in mind we operate under sort of a framing of subsidiarity. What can we do to the lowest level and do that as we can, right? And so I think the same is true in some senses about change, right? And cultural shift, right? It has to be kind of this, start where you can at the lowest possible level and build outward. And I think that's also a question or an issue to Jerry's point about power. And one of the things, the way our economy is structured right now, and again, you can, there's a line of thought that this is very deliberate, right? To disempower people, to not have time, right? We're working all the time. We are, we don't have access to, good institutions and healthy environments and all these kinds of things. It's really, really hard to have an operating democracy when the polity does not have time. It does not have good health. It does not have engagement and connection to one another. These are things essential for a healthy democracy. And so in many ways, community wealth building is about how do we begin to change that at the local level so that people do have more power, both individually and as a collective. They have more time in their days because they have greater control of their work environment, right? They have greater health because they're making decisions about, how, institutions are investing locally and not extracting. So that's part of the theory there. And, it is rooted in that, it's a toggle. It's a both and thinking. We're not going to individual consumer choice our way out of these crises. We're not, right? But we also have to empower that the individual needs to be the unit of change, and then that sort of builds to a collective, right? So we all have to be able to take certain responsibilities for our thinking and our change. And that's really hard to do when we're isolated and atomized and not connected and not supported and not in solidaritous environments. And so, you can get into this chicken or the egg kind of thinking that can really be disempowering. And you could argue that is what's intended so that we remove ourselves from things. But you need to start where you can, right? And I really do think the reason why local is important is because it shows what you can do. It gives an art of the possible. It empowers that sense of individual in collective making change, and you can see it. It's tangible. It's not theoretical. And I think that really is necessary. And so in terms of individual change and culture shift, it's really just getting involved in what's happening. Is your local park getting demolished or built? Like, what can you do about that? How can you talk to your neighbor? That sort of thing, and begin to build up from there. Start where you can with what you have, even if it feels like it's really, really small against the backdrop of everything that's happening.
I think that's a really good point, Sarah. I guess it's really highlighting that to help people feel able to make change, you need to act at the level that you have agency in, I guess. And that can be to maybe challenge conversations with friends, colleagues, family. But it's also about positive action and doing things that can sort of help lead to change. Martin, Jerry, or Mohsen, did you want to kind of respond to that, or shall we move on to the next question? I'll follow your lead.
So a couple of things kind of occurred to me. So one is that, in all of this, we do have to recognize people are very adaptable. I think that's one thing that's underemphasized. And, kind of that's how people have become used to the system that we're in. The flip side of that is people would quite rapidly become used to a different system, as long as it's not a terrible one, and people acclimatize. So I think that's interesting. I think we do need to be sensible about not projecting too utopian visions onto people. We know that if nothing else, an immutable part of human nature is that people are driven by status and recognition. And in our current system, that maps onto sort of wealth and financial return. But whatever cultural system you're in, that sort of status seeking is going to be there. So, we have to be realistic about that. And I think particularly flipping the question a little bit, I think if we think about those of us who are interested in alternative futures and alternative models, it's incumbent on us to actually be sensible and be tolerant of a multiplicity of views, and not commit the error, which is what is really sort of doomed the current iteration of the, whatever you want to call it, the left or the progressive movement of sort of, we can't deal with anybody who is not ideologically pure. That is guaranteed defeat. We have to deal with everyone who is sincere, who may have profoundly different visions for us, but with whom at least we share the idea of wanting to improve things. That's
really helpful, and I think it really segues nicely. I'm going to assume that Jerry and Mohsen are happy to kind of move to the next question. So we've got a couple more questions, and then Jerry will take us through and summarize the key messages from today's discussion. The next question's really it sort of builds on what you were saying to some extent, I think, Martin. Challenging economic paradigm is no small task. what do you see the leading what role do you see leading economists playing in this shift? And what's the role of other sectors, and how can we all contribute to the change? And I think you've probably answered some of this, but I think what we're asking you to do now is to really think about what is the economic community, what's their role, and how can they help the rest of us and other kind of critical stakeholders really try to kind of create the opportunity to see some of these changes. Who would like to go first?
I'm happy to jump into change the
Great.
order.
Okay.
I think, what you mentioned is important, that this is not a task that can be done by one group only. So, it requires both, economists as insiders who can shift the discipline from within, and, outsiders who can change the terms of public debate. For leading economists, I think the role is to use the authority reflexively rather than defensively. And what that means is understanding and acknowledging the limits of the models, being transparent about values and assumptions are embedded in them, and making a space for pluralism, for feminist, ecological, post-colonial, and institutional perspectives that have long been marginalized within mainstream economics. Economists are already inside powerful institutions, whether these are universities, central banks, or international institutions like IMF. They can help by widening the boundaries of what counts as credible knowledge. But as you mentioned, the shift won't come from economists alone. Those in other sectors, educators, journalists, policymakers, unions, even artists, all play crucial roles, in my view, in reshaping how society talks about the economy. Educators can teach economics as a moral and political field, not just a technical one. Journalists can question the economic common sense that treats things like austerity and growth as natural laws. And artists and storytellers can really reimagine what things like prosperity look like, and make economic structures visible in our everyday life. I think changing economics requires sort of a broader cultural movement, one that claims the economy as really a shared social project.
That's a really nice way of describing it, a shared social project. I guess operating at the local level and then moving up through the different levels of jurisdictions, to the global level. That's a lovely ambition. Sarah, Jerry, or Martin, did you want to make a comment on and build on what Mohsen said? Or you might argue with him. You might have a different view.
So, no, I have a couple of things to build on there, thinking about, the question was specifically about economists. So firstly, I've kind of more recently, I'm really going out kind of into the world quite hard to push my sort of ecological economics take on health economics with health economists and some other kind of economists, but primarily with health economists. And honestly, I'm pushing on an open door. Actually, there are people who are, very receptive to the sort of the critique, but also the solutions that I'm suggesting. So it's absolutely not as hard as we might think. Part of that is because one of the problems is, I think, even in kind of more mainstream kind of macroeconomics and things, trained economists broadly do have a reasonable understanding of the limitations of the models and the assumptions, as Mohsen was talking about. It's the users of economics, so particularly the politicians and the media and people, who often take more simplistic and sort of straitjacket approaches. And I think one of the things I try to do, but that I encourage other economists to do, is particularly in a sort of media or a kind of public setting, is to push back on stupid questions and to not answer the question as framed, but to answer what is a better question, because I think a lot of things are forced it is believed that there is a deep consensus amongst economists, when that is often not true. It's just they're asked very kind of loaded questions and forced to answer a particular way.
So thanks, Martin. I think that's a really nice way to sort of finish these questions. We're running a little bit behind time, so I might wind up now the questions and hand over to Jerry. But I'd like to thank all four of you, in particular the three speakers, for sharing the really great insights that you've had, for having a stimulating and conversation. I think we could keep going for much longer, but I'll now hand over to Jerry, who'll do a bit of a summation of the critical points that we've covered today in today's session. Thanks, Jerry.
And thanks, Carmel, and thanks to speakers. There's always a risk of trying to do this kind of job of summing up that I misrepresent people or put words in people's mouths, and so please forgive me, and any mistakes are all mine. So I think we've had a really interesting conversation today. Martin started by presenting a case that ever-increasing consumption will not necessarily maximize utility. And that's a flawed assumption that's quite core to many sort of mainstream economics, neoclassical economics approaches. So in a sense, it is true that we can have too much of a good thing. That's in essence what Martin's described, and he described that in relation to healthcare, where it's really, really clear. And that's really important in the domain of healthcare, because healthcare is a really expensive public service. It accounts for a large proportion of public spending, and it's also important because commercial interests can often capture that state spending, and so challenging where there is overconsumption of healthcare is a really important task, especially where those commercial interests have their fingers in particular pies. But I think Martin's insights can also be applied much more broadly. So on a personal level, we all know that eating too much, that's not good for you. So overconsumption in that regard. But it also applies very acutely at population level. So individuals simply maximizing utility through this kind of economic assumption have impacts for the planet, for biodiversity, that I don't need to rehearse here. And what Martin has advised us all is that, well, neoclassical economics might not be able to answer these questions, but there's many, many other branches of economics, whether that's ecological economics or feminist economics or Marxist economics, that offer us insights to better understand the world and how the economy actually works. And I think this is a really nice segue into what Mohsen offered us today. So Mohsen described how it's not that we lack different economic insights or approaches, it's that we're not using them. And why is that the case? Why has neoclassical economics become so dominant in our policy discourses? Why is it that students only learn a narrow range of economic insights in most of our institutions? Some exceptions, I'm sure, in places that Martin and Mohsen teach. But by and large, people will get taught neoclassical economics in a very narrow range of assumptions around that. So how has that come to pass? And Mohsen also encouraged us to ask the question, in whose interest does that dominance serve? And I think the answer has been that it largely serves the interests of elites and those who already own substantial economic capital. So it's certainly not in the interests of ethnic minorities, of women, of majority populations, of trade unionists or workers. And we see the impacts of this kinds of dominance of flawed economic assumptions. So in my own work, I've seen how the assumption that reducing government debt will maximise economic growth and bring about benefits has led to the imposition of austerity across many high-income countries, including the UK, Australia and the USA, where many of the speakers today are from. And that has directly led to, and we've now got really strong evidence, life expectancy trends no longer improving and indeed getting worse in our most disadvantaged communities. And so after all of that, I was so glad to hear Sarah's more positive kind of solution orientated and talk. Not that there was anything wrong with Mohsen or Martin's contributions, but we needed that sort of segue into something that we can do. And Sarah's work over the years on community wealth building in our presentation this morning, I think offers us that sort of empowering vision of how we might respond even when we feel disempowered, even when we feel small, even when we feel battered about in the tides and the winds of sort of global economic policies, because it gives us that practical agenda of actions that many of us can push for, either in our own local communities or our institutions where we work. Many of us will work in what Sarah described as anchor institutions, those institutions that have a public purpose, that are rooted within one particular population or area. And what was most interesting and important, I think, about what Sarah's described here is not just that that can change outcomes, which it can, and there's lots of evidence now emerging from Preston, the example in Northwest England that Sarah pointed to, where we know that community wealth building has increased employment and median wages, improved life satisfaction, reduced antidepressant prescribing, all in comparison to other areas that didn't introduce community wealth building. But more important than that, it builds a new economic power base that's distributed and not held by elites, and it offers us that new imagination that actually we can democratize the economy. So bringing these things together, I think overall we can be clear that there's a large and growing evidence base that challenges these neoclassical assumptions. It's already out there. And in the podcast that Carmel mentioned at the start, we heard from other speakers who have been systematically reviewing that evidence base over the years and challenging these economic assumptions with empirical data and evidence. And what this means then is that evidence and policy have become disconnected. Politics and economics in many ways have become disconnected because, as Martin describes, it's no longer enough that we simply vote in politicians who can then implement what they want, because economics in a way has become de-democratized, as Zygmunt Bauman has described. It's become dominated by the economics profession and very narrow range of economic ideas. So we need to understand power. We need to understand how that power is being used through economic policy to generate particular economic relationships and economic institutions. We need to understand how that benefits particular groups, and it's the usual sort of historic victors, people with white skin, the owners of capital, men. And I think what Mohsen described near the end is a really nice way of thinking about where we move forward. So we need a shared social project, as he said, and that's finding ways of working together in our networks and institutions, and our social groups to resist this concentration of power. And Sarah's described some very practical ways that we might do that. But most importantly, I think, is that the evidence is with us on this. We know that this range of heterodox economics approaches helps us understand the world much better in many ways than the neoclassical approach. And the future of our planet, never mind equity and other outcomes such as the health of our populations, really depends on it. So thank you very, very much to Mohsen, Martin and Sarah for your insights this morning. And I'll hand back to Carmel.
So thanks so much for that wonderful bringing everything together, Jerry. I think you've really kind of captured all the critical kind of conversations. It's been a really wonderful discussion, and we're coming to an end. The Centre for Health and Policies and the University of Glasgow really want to thank each of these wonderful speakers for their valuable time, their key insights, and the really great contributions of the discussion today. I hope people feel that it's helped them get a sense and uncover some of the kind of institutional things operating, and that actually we are able to make challenges, we are able to be hopeful, and we are able to, in small ways, really contribute to how we can improve these. I'm really pleased to share and put on screen the Challenging Economic Assumptions podcast series, where Sarah and Martin and Mohsen have joined us, along with, I think we're up to 8 or 9 now, maybe, Jerry. I can't remember exactly how many. And we're talking and making plans for additional speakers in 2026. So this will continue in 2026. So thank you very much for your time, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening.